Nice. Thank you, Karsten and Peter. Thanks for this chance to talk about some of the things that we've been working on these last couple of years. These are my co-authors on this presentation. You'll see that this covers several different projects, formal projects. We would not have been able to succeed or get where we've gotten without a lot of help from the measurement and instrumentation point of view, the funding, and the synergistic and collaborative advice that we've gotten from these folks. I want to thank everyone here on at the outset. So what I'll do today is try to give you my view of what's going on in the industry with these different sectors. We'll talk a little bit about the EDF methane leakage study and their design. I'll show you a map in North America of some of the places we've been. And the real primary method that we're using is this dual tracer flux ratio approach. So I'll take a little bit of time to explain that, not too much though. And we'll just walk through a quick example plume and have a look at that. What I'm going to do then is just give a very quick overview of some of the important emission ratios that do help us pinpoint leak vectors. The most important is ethane, ethane to methane ratio. But I'll look also at CO2 and SO2 together in a tandem, and then we'll look a little bit at benzene as well. All right, so this is my schematic. I've got a picture of a fracked well cartooned out here, or conventional well. These things come up to the surface at production sites. A lot of times these production sites will have on-site liquid. Then they all move into the gathering network, which collects this stuff and pushes it to Disneyland, the processing facilities that are trying to produce transmission-grade gas that will go that long distance to where it's used by consumers. And I'll say that even though ethane is noted right here at the processing step by name, you actually see it throughout. It's ubiquitously useful through all of these sectors. Somewhere between the gathering network and the processing plants, there's these treatment steps to get rid of these nuisance species. That's the second ratio that I'll talk about. And then finally, typically where we see associated oil production or production pads that have a lot of well condensate tanks, we do see benzene, which is the third emission ratio that I'll talk a little bit about here. So the majority of the work that I'll be talking about that was used to form this view, not all of it, was through the methane leakage study that EDF managed to get industry partners to fund. It's tricky and interesting working with industry and the cooperation. They offer the potential for an awful lot of information, but there are some biases and concerns that we have to be very cautious of as we're working on them. And I invite discussion about that or conversations outside. But I'll just point out it was organized into these modules named here. We directly participated in 4 as well as a few others. So. And on the back of this map that's a little bit blurry for a reason, there are about 200 sites that were visited throughout this project. So the dual tracer ratio, what we're trying to do in this case, I'll just very quickly for someone who hasn't seen this, say you've got a potential methane emission leak at this cylinder here on site, and it's unknown. We don't know what that leak rate is. What we'll do is we'll come on site and set up 2 tracers, a primary and auxiliary tracer. We'll spread them out, sometimes with advanced understanding of where the likely leak vectors are. Sometimes we go in blind and then move them around a little bit later in the day. And we let off controlled known releases. In the ideal circumstance with something like the Aerodyne Mobile Laboratory, we'll collect transects downwind where there have been sufficient time for co-dispersion in the atmosphere of both of the tracer species. And then we have a lock. We see that when the 2 tracers have that identical plume structure, any methane that we see probably is coming from a locus within this facility, and we can use that downwind molar ratio and the known release rate to quantify pretty accurately an emission of the methane. Of course, we don't always have such ideal circumstances, or we want to push it a little bit more and use all the information we get, and on these closer transects, you see when we get the separation of the tracer and the methane, you can really sort of start to identify where geographically on site the leak is taking place. This is a quick example transect. We're doing a release experiment located down here with the red X, and the wind is blowing it up this way. I'll just point out that geographically this is sort of trying to show you a cartoon of where we're seeing methane up this south to north transect. This is that same time series, again in time going south to north. And we look at the methane, we see sort of three good features: a little bit of activity at the beginning, something in the middle, and that sharp peak there at the end. The first thing we do is put ethane on top of there, and that immediately tells us that that second plume is probably not thermogenic methane, it's something else, but that the first set of activity and the second are. I'll point out that later in this session, Mackenzie Smith will be talking about the value of ethane, and I'll direct you for even more incisive understanding to Tara Yakovic's poster later this afternoon to understand how we're utilizing ethane to methane ratios in these ways. But we're not done there. We'll look at the tracer species. So these are the two tracers compounds that we were using for that test. And look at that. They're right on top of one another. This is good. We check to make sure they're showing up in the ratio that we know we're releasing it at. They are. This is good. That gives us an internal check on what the test of that equivalent dispersion might be. It gives us almost an internal standard to what the error is. And then we see concomitant methane here. We quantify this and come up with a methane flux for the site. And we're not being fooled by this other thermogenic methane that was a well pad that was right next to the side of the road. Doug will be talking about a more sophisticated, later this morning, a more sophisticated application of the tracer data. When we add CO2 to this, we clearly see that indeed that non-thermogenic plume has this enhanced CO2. This was because of livestock that was right here near the side of the road. Cody Florshinger's got a poster tomorrow morning on this that talks about the ratio of observed methane to CO2, the rumen to breath, if you will. And Rob Roscioli will also talk about looking at enhanced ammonia that's associated with livestock methane. Finally, when we add the second member of the combustion quintet, carbon monoxide, we see that indeed we're reminded that there was an emission control device at work, an enclosed combustor here, and Knighton's got a poster that looks at that combustion efficiency by looking at that CO2 ratio as well as other VOCs to actually ascertain how well those devices are controlling emissions. So the first ratio that I promised to talk to you about, ethane, one of the most powerful ones, what the real point of this figure is to say, even at these large gas processing plants where there's a real variety of different types of equipment, what we see is that we can link that observed ethane to methane ratio in the downwind plumes to the activity that's taking place on site. Up here in the north where we see this fantastically high ethane to methane ratio, this is where all the liquid storage is taking place. This facility was distilling out the ethane, the propane, and butane and keeping it up here until it could be moved off site. The actual work of doing the processing as well as the recompression and transmission onto the transmission sector was taking place down here. And in this case, we're apportioning for the site-wide emissions 90% of the methane to that activity in the transmission. This place used wet seals to do that compression, and this is really a designed leak that's taking place. Using that ethane to methane in a more general sense through these different campaigns, we see that we agree very favorably with what the operators know to be the ethane content, or they think is the ethane content. We do, of course, point out that the ethane to methane ratio varies greatly from different geological formations in north central Marcellus in the dry gas region relative to, say, a Denver-Julesburg wet region. And Rob Roscioli's tabulated this very nicely for a lot of different places that we've been to. I was actually surprised when we started showing some of this lock-in with the ethane that there was actually quite a bit of buy-in from the operators. It's like, oh, okay, maybe you do know what you're talking about when you attribute these leaks. Here's another example of this, and the point is really just to look at this map to say that this gathering site had both compressors that we know have these design leaks and a tank battery, a condensate tank battery. In this case, we're able to use that ethane to methane ratio to attribute about half of the methane emissions were due to poorly controlled release of methane from the tank top. And Austin Mitchell has found throughout the course of the gathering and processing module workup that indeed the emissions from these tank batteries at gathering sites can really end up being significant and do not necessarily scale with what you would expect from the facility's throughput. All right, another interesting cohort that we look at here, in this case, the acid gas removal or the amine treatment. I won't take the time to describe this too much, but we were told that this acid gas release on the regeneration side could be it's a vector, a potential vector for methane emissions. And in this case, this treatment facility was a little bit unique. There were no other combustion sources on the site. We know this CO2 was actually all due to removal from the high content present before it was sent on for eventual processing. And what we've concluded from this is that it's actually the amine treatment can be quite efficient. At least in this case, that piece of equipment was working quite well. Here's another example. The acid gas treatment also works for hydrogen sulfide removal, and in this case, at this particular facility, they were not taking the time to reduce this all the way to sulfur. It was a reasonably small outfit, and they were just flaring the H2S rather than releasing the odoriferous nuisance. And so we do see the presence of SO2 in these downwind transects. I'll point out that this isn't new. H2S is known to be observed in sour gas regions. Okay, so our third emission ratio, this is, we're doing a tracer experiment here. This is, we're looking at benzene, and we see in this particular downwind transect, about a mile downwind, good correlation between the tracer, methane, ethane, and here benzene. We are seeing, in this case, for this characterization, about 4 per 1,000 molar benzene to methane. And this is sort of typical of what we see in wet gas regions, somewhere between 1 and 4, and it's significantly lower in dry gas regions. This compares favorably to your paper, Karsten, in the Uinta Basin that saw something in that range, but maybe a little lower. So I've talked a little bit about what's going on with this dual tracer flux ratio. Throughout these different sectors, we've observed different types of cohort emissions that help us lock in on what the specific emission vector is, and when possible, actually apportion the total methane emissions that we see on site to a specific piece of equipment type. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Scott?
Russ.
Yeah, if I did the arithmetic right very quickly, it looked like the cattle facility there's something like 5% of the carbon coming out of the cattle was methane. Did I lose a decimal point somewhere?
You sound like a great candidate to go tomorrow morning to Cody's poster to learn all about it.
All right,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's what it is. 50 per 1,000, 5%, yeah.
Thank you, Scott.